We're being live streamed, and I was told that we need to begin, so welcome everyone. Good morning. Ira Jackson is my name. I'm Dean of the John W. McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies here at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I have just a few very brief comments, but first I wanted to welcome Ben Slomoff and his family who have joined us from London and San Francisco. This symposium is named in honor of Ben and his late wife Sylvia. He's been a tremendous supporter of our conflict resolution program, our Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance, and the school itself. And again, Ben, we want to welcome you and thank you for your generosity. I've got a feeling that he doesn't like being the center of attention, but I've got the microphone and I am the dean. And I'll just mention that Ben is a graduate of our conflict resolution program, class of 1997, when he was 83 years old. He's now 100 years old, going strong, looking great, making a difference, and inspiring us all. Thanks, Ben. The university where we gather is celebrating its 50th anniversary, so in a sense, we're just coming of age. We're an adolescent, young institution that, but the price of progress is we have $800 million worth of construction taking place out here, so apologies for our progress and the interruptions. But at a similar podium just a week ago, Vicki Kennedy launching the new Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate, doing it at a podium at the Kennedy Library just next door, said, here at the John F. Kennedy Library, looking out at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute on the lovely campus of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, Columbia Point is the place to be. So we feel that energy all around us. Our school, the John W. McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, is only a part of that emergence, and I'd reflect just for a moment upon who John W. McCormick was and the contributions he made, so that those of you who don't remember your American history will be refreshed by the following facts. He was a congressman from this district. He grew up in poverty, extreme poverty, in South Boston. His family was so poor that he had to drop out of school in the 8th grade to support his 4 surviving siblings. The other 4 had died from tuberculosis, which was then called the Irish Plague. It was a disease of poverty. He went on to become a lawyer without a high school degree. He served in Congress for 41 years and was a legislative floor leader for FDR in the passage of Social Security, and he was Speaker of the House when he and President Johnson carried civil rights reform, Medicare, and Medicaid. He also was a legislative champion of the Marshall Plan at the end of the Second World War and of the Peace Corps. So as we begin this Slomoff Symposium on religion, conflict, and the divides in society, I think John McCormick would be, he's smiling on us and his school. Just a word about the department in which the Conflict Resolution Department resides. It's chaired by Eben Weitzman, who you're going to be hearing from shortly. He and Darren Q have done a magnificent job putting together this symposium, which is now, I think, in its 17th year, having attracted in the past such luminaries as Richard Hackman from Harvard, George Mitchell, the peacemaker, and last year, Christiana Figueres, who's the executive secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, arguably the most powerful person in the world dealing with one of the most intractable problems of our day. We're taking on new intractable problems in this conference today, and before introducing the provost, I also want to give a shout out to a special friend who I last saw in Kaduna, Nigeria, where he and his partner, the pastor and the imam, are working at the front lines of peace and reconciliation in a war-torn northern Nigeria. So welcome Imam Ashafa. I'm under explicit orders not to offer an extensive introduction of my boss, the provost, but I will say this about Winston Langley. He is the architect, the intellectual and academic architect of everything that we're doing out here at the University of Massachusetts, a student-centered, major urban research university with a teaching soul and global reach. And he encouraged us to be both local and global, to marry theory and practice, and it just so happens that his academic and scholarly interests are on the topic of the day. So without further ado, Provost Winston Langley.
Good morning. I'm very pleased to be among you and to bring you the greetings of the university on behalf of the Chancellor of the University, Chancellor Keith Motley. I want to say thanks to Ben Slomoff, a lifelong scholar, university alumnus, member of the Board of Visitors, for his dedication, not only to the Conflict Resolution Department, but to the practice of peaceful mediation. It is quite important that we have gatherings like the one we have today, where scholars and practitioners, both of academic disciplines and the spiritual faith, can come together to explore how we can improve the conditions under which peace may be nurtured and sustained, not simply taming existing conflicts. It is also important that we take what we have come to call a hands-on approach to our academic pursuits. We at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, think in terms of a translational approach to teaching and research, where the highly theoretical engagements, which are always necessary to lend greater understanding of the meaning of things, must be combined with the applied side. And our Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance seeks to effect this combination. It is also important that we expose our students and community partners to this type of work. I'd like to bring to your attention, and this is a brief comment, the 1975 Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance and of Discrimination based on religion and belief, that was adopted in that year by the United Nations. It begins with the claim that there is something called human dignity, and that dignity is linked to something called belief and identity. It also extends this sort of reasoning to what we may call the world of meaning, and the relationship between meaning and belief, and the linkage between meaning, belief, and human loyalty. It notes, however, that meaning and belief and human loyalty, when linked to identity, have been a cause of untold human suffering through warfare, through cultural divisions, something that has led even to attempts at extinguishing other forms of identity, the crime we have come to call genocide. The Declaration, along with the UN Charter, therefore, calls on us, not just nation states, but individuals and every organ of society, I don't think we can doubt that universities are one of the essential, basic organs of society. To take what has come to be called joint and separate action, to ensure that religion and belief does not serve as a dividing spirit in our effort to promote a species consciousness and the unity of human beings. This conference, therefore, this get-together this morning that seeks to bridge religious divides is in the spirit of the UN Charter, is in the spirit of what we have come to call human rights and responsibility. It's in the spirit of human identity, species identity. It's in the spirit of our effort to sustain our country, the planet Earth. Thank you for having me in your presence. I look forward to the results of your discussions today and hope that it will serve as one of many stepping stones to our honoring our obligation to all earlier generations who have been a victim of religious divide. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Eben Weitzman. I'm the chair of the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance, and director of our graduate programs in conflict resolution. I am reminded this morning why it is always a bad idea to have to speak directly after our provost. Welcome here this morning. I want to first thank our Dean, Ira Jackson, the fearless leader of our Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies, an exciting and growing place to be, and our Provost, Winston Langley, who has been a champion and supporter of our programs going back to our founding in the mid-'80s, first as a fellow member of the faculty and later as provost. Welcome to our annual Sylvia and Benjamin Slomoff Lecture in Conflict Resolution, now a symposium. Ira has already said a word or two about Ben, but I must say a few more words because Ben is one of the most inspiring people I've ever met. Here's a quick little synopsis of Ben's life, my Cliff Notes. After high school, Ben went to work selling shoes. He left the shoe business to serve in the armed forces in World War II. After something like 14 years, he retired as, I believe, a lieutenant colonel, and then went back to work in the shoe business. He wound up owning his own shoe company, owning several factories, and having a full career in that business. After retiring, Ben came to UMass Boston to do his undergraduate degree. After that, he came and did first a certificate and then a master's in conflict resolution with us, graduating, as Ira said, in 1987. It was then, in his mid-80s, that Ben decided to launch a new career as a mediator and arbitrator. He has until very recently been handling several multi-million-dollar cases at once, flying back and forth to Hawaii for mediation and arbitration sessions, and so on. And about a year and a half ago, he published a book of his own poetry. If you're really nice to me over the course of the 2 days, I'll pull out my iPhone and show you a video of Ben at his 100th birthday in November, leading a room of about 150 people singing Louis Armstrong's "What a Wonderful World." Each year, as Iris told you, each year since 1999, with Ben's generous support, we have held this lectureship in the name of Ben and his wife, late wife, Sylvia. This has been one of the most exciting events we have each year. Ira has given you the names of some of the remarkable people who have spoken. This year, in honor of Ben's 100th birthday, we decided to expand our effort. We decided, instead of a single lecture, to have a 2-day symposium devoted to exploring the themes that unite the work of our conflict resolution faculty. And so we've designed this symposium on the theme of bridging global religious divides. Some of the work that we hope to pull together, that we want to explore together, to mention a few items: Darren Q leads our work in Nigeria with Imam Ashafa and Pastor James Wuye. We have Parag O'Malley, one of our faculty members here, leads a project on the Forum for Cities in Transition and its communities all over the world. David Matz has for a long time been involved with Neve Shalom Wahat al-Salam, the Oasis of Peace village in Israel, where we are working to build a peace college. Darren Q and I have been working for quite some time with the Bridges Project here in Massachusetts, which brings together local leaders of the local Muslim and Sikh communities with representatives of federal, state, and local law enforcement. And we have a variety of new engagements with the McCormick Leadership Council members and friends like Farah Pandith, who's the former special representative to Muslim communities from the State Department and one of our keynote speakers here, and Charlie Sennett, who's the Vice President of Global Post and an excellent journalist who you will also be hearing from over the next 2 days. We're looking to bring our partners in this work together with one another to learn from one another's experiences and try to identify both best practices and directions for future intellectual exploration. The goal of the symposium, then, is to bring together practitioners, policymakers, and academics to discuss and analyze their experiences in initiatives that attempt to bridge religious divides, with the goal of defining new research questions and field practices and policy directions in inter- and intra-religious peace building. The goal will be achieved through 3 fabulous keynote speakers, 4 substantive panel discussions, and a facilitated group dialogue on day 2, tomorrow afternoon, actually late tomorrow morning and into the afternoon, when we'll be giving all of you, the participants here, an opportunity to meet together in different groups, identify key themes and learning from the 2 days, and feed those back into the large group discussion with the panel. Now, to get us going, I'd like to begin by introducing our first keynote speaker. Dr. Bruce Hemmer is a research analyst in the Office of Learning and Training at the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations at the U.S. Department of State. He's worked for this bureau or its predecessor, the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, since May of 2010. He supports the Conflict and Stabilization Operations, or CSO, engagement teams on methods for conflict assessment and program monitoring, theories of change development, and topical research. He also plans and manages or conducts evaluations. Bruce completed his PhD in political science at the University of California, Irvine in 2009, specializing in the civic and cultural aspects of democratization and peace building, and conducting field research in Bosnia and Northern Ireland. He previously earned an MA in International Relations at Syracuse University and a Certificate of Achievement in Conflict Resolution and its program on the analysis and resolution of conflicts. Bruce has several years of prior practical experience in peace building and democratization, principally in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where he worked with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. He's also worked with several peace-building NGOs in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Ethiopia, including the Carter Center, and is a trained mediator. All of this makes him a superb person to begin our symposium with this address. Hammer.
Hello, very glad to be here. I'm not the speaker that was originally promised. Our Deputy Assistant Secretary, Jerry White, regrets that he could not come. He had an important policy meeting that he felt he had to attend instead, so I've come in his place. I work for Jerry, and we've been working together for several years now. Jerry is very much focused on the issue of religion and conflict. In fact, we recently reorganized slightly so he can focus on it more within our bureau. And he's focused mostly on the Middle East, and we're working on a concept for an intervention there in the West Bank that will focus on developing tourism as a sustainable industry in the West Bank as a means of using economics to get at the religious conflict there. We are led by an assistant secretary, Rick Barton, who was previously at CSIS, where, among many reports, he was a co-author of a report entitled Mixed Blessings, a U.S. Engagement with Religion in Conflict-Prone Settings. So from the very top, we have leaders of our bureau who are very much interested in this topic. Now, I myself am not an expert in religion and conflict per se, but I have studied peace building and democratization, and along the way, of course, have dealt often with the issue of religion and also religious peace builders. One of my most interesting discoveries was the role that this played in Northern Ireland and the contrast between that and Bosnia. It's where I did my dissertation research. In Northern Ireland, there's an ecumenical community called the Corrymeela community. Some of you may have heard of it. That's been an instrumental nursery of peace-building organizations in Northern Ireland. It happened to have been founded before the Troubles started, back in the 60s. And this ecumenical community out in the countryside served as a place where people came together and thought. And this, over time, spawned a number of other organizations, such as the Integrated Schools Movement, which has been creating private schools where Catholics and Protestants come together and develop relationships from an early age. And that's become more popular than the public schools run by the government or the parochial schools. They have a long waiting list to get into those integrated schools. Also, the Northern Ireland Mixed Marriage Association is another example of something that came out of that ecumenical community, and there are many others. Whereas in Bosnia, there was nothing quite like that. And in fact, the religious institutions had been so dominated by the state during the communist period that they became very hierarchical and somewhat ossified. And while they were very instrumental in humanitarian relief at the grassroots level, the peace-building elements were limited mostly to the very top level of those hierarchies, and there was very little of that going on at the grassroots level where there was little autonomy to do so. So just an interesting example of how the way that religion and conflict operates can be very contextualized, and that's something of a theme in my remarks here. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit broadly about the State Department and about CSO and its mission and how this interacts with the issue of religion and conflict. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how our method of conflict analysis takes into account the issue of religion and the role of religious leaders. And then I'm going to talk specifically about a number of our engagements around the world and how religion and conflict has been featured in each of them. So first off, CSO, the Bureau for Conflict and Stabilization Operations. This was created, a little over 2 years now. There was a previous organization called the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, for which I also worked. But this, creating it as a full-fledged bureau in the State Department gave it a lot more presence and sort of oomph in the bureaucracy, with now its own dedicated assistant secretary. And the mission that we've decided upon is, or the mission statement is that it advances national security by breaking cycles of violent conflict in priority countries around the world. So we don't work everywhere in the world. We're somewhat strategic about where we choose to operate. And our method is to try to be catalytic. It means working a lot with local partners, and a lot of those are religious actors. And to try to be innovative and agile in what we do. And a lot of times that means learning from those local partners of new ways of operating in that context. We try to combine what we call expeditionary diplomacy with programming. So what that means is putting diplomats outside of the embassy, outside the wire in conflict situations, in the subnational areas oftentimes. An example is in South Sudan, where we had people, and as South Sudan was becoming an independent country and holding a referendum, we had officers spread throughout the 10 states of South Sudan helping to monitor that situation and try to keep things calm as that process went forward. But we combine that now with actual programming, so it's not just people out there talking to other people, but actually money that we can use to try to improve things by building capacity, for instance. And then that particular combination of subnational expeditionary diplomacy with programming is something of a niche for CSO, which is different from the way a lot of other conflict actors in the U.S. government operate. And then another common element, as it turns out, across many of our engagements is that we're often trying to change the popular narrative about violence and about nonviolence. And we're also often trying to build coalitions by connecting positive actors across the country. Now, this relates to broader work in the State Department and across the U.S. government on the issue of religion and conflict. So I want to highlight a few of these things. First, the Secretary of State has a religion and foreign policy working group that we've been very much a part of. And this is very collaborative with non-governmental religious groups who come and participate in this working group. And there's one sub-working group of that working group that's on religion and conflict, and Jerry White, who was going to be here today, co-chairs that sub-working group. So that's one way in which we're very much involved in this. And this relates to a broader U.S. government policy that's out of the White House, the U.S. strategy on religious leader and faith community engagement. And this is meant to be very much a two-way engagement, not just viewing religious organizations as implementing partners for our programs who take our money and do what we told. No, it's very much a two-way engagement where we depend upon their advice and their ideas, their creativities, and also respect the need for independence of religious actors. These are not arms of the U.S. government. This broad policy has three main objectives, one of which is to prevent and mitigate and resolve conflict. The other two are, one is sustainable development and improving humanitarian response, working with religious actors. And then the other is protecting pluralism and human rights for religious actors, especially religious freedom. Now, there's also recently established in August a State Department Office of Faith-Based Community Initiatives, which we're also working very closely with. This is currently engaging in a set of 3 case studies of the U.S. government working with religion and conflict in countries around the world. The first one is underway right now in Ethiopia. The other 2 will probably also be countries where there's been conflict associated with religion. And the goal of this is to produce a paper that will provide a methodology for religious engagement by the United States government, establishing some best practices. And we've been very much involved in providing staff to help this office conduct these case studies. So then there are other arms of the State Department that are also involved in this, which I'll just briefly mention. There's an Office of International Religious Freedom that deals with the human rights aspects. There's also an Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. There's a Special Envoy to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I think it's supposed to be the Islamic Conference. There's a Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. And there's a Special Representative to Muslim communities. So as you can see, there's quite a bit of engagement by the State Department with the issue of religion and conflict specifically. Another effort of our office in particular, and this is part of a broader push, is to create a course at the Foreign Service Institute, which trains our diplomats on religion and conflict specifically. There'll be other courses as we go forward on other aspects of dealing with religion. There was a long-standing, more general course, but this is a more specific course on religion and conflict specifically that has 3 main elements. One is the issue of the Establishment Clause of the Constitution, which is something that sometimes inhibits our work in certain ways. This is the U.S. government cannot be involved in establishing a religion, which applies in our international work as well to a certain degree, although it's a bit different in international work. And it's a bit of a legal gray area, so it creates a lot of confusion about what we can do or can't do. And I'll give a case of that later on. And different lawyers come to different conclusions about this. So this part of this course is to try to shed what clarity or create what clarity can be created around this issue, so it's easier for our diplomats and our people working in international development to interact with religious leaders and religious issues. And the other 2 elements of that course deal with religious perceptions and misperceptions and bias, and then also just navigating difficult situations in the religious landscape. So I want to talk a little bit about how we do conflict analysis and how this is very much open to religious issues and religious actors. So we base our conflict analysis on something called the Interagency Conflict Assessment Framework, the ICAF. Darren here has been involved in using the USAID version, which is the conflict assessment framework, but they're very similar. This is based on a few basic ideas about conflict and about how it works. So one is the notion that conflict isn't necessarily bad. Sometimes conflict can be what we call constructive, like the conflict associated with the civil rights movement. That was a type of conflict, but it produced good results and was conducted in a nonviolent way. You can also think of conflict as destructive, so violent conflict, for instance, or certain unproductive or harmful forms of nonviolent conflict even, such as hate speech, is not a type of conflict that is helpful. So there's the notion of conflict transformation, which in a nutshell is trying to move a system of destructive conflict into a system of constructive conflict, where conflict is handled in a more productive and helpful way and less harmful. And the theory involved here, well, some of the theories are involved here, is that for one thing, we need to look not simply at what's negative in a society or in a conflict system, but what's positive, what's working or what could work well to move this from a destructive to a constructive type of conflict. And then another element of that is the importance of leadership. So it's not just grievances that create conflict. If poverty created conflict on its own, there'd be a lot more conflict in the world. It requires leaders who mobilize people around a particular grievance to create conflict. And similarly, working for peace building, there's something we could call resiliencies in a society, sort of the latent energy for peace building, of which religion often plays a factor, that need to be also mobilized by what we call key actors or leaders, influential people, for them to actually blossom into real peace-building efforts rather than just being a kind of latent energy in the society. And then one other element here is the issue of time. That transformation is more likely to happen in certain windows in time that shift the strategic calculus of these actors, that may cause actors who are promoting conflict to shift towards promoting peace, for instance, or cause new, more peaceful actors to emerge because they see more opportunity to be effective. One good example of this is an election, which can be an opportunity either for conflict or for peace building. But oftentimes it's a time when you get more violence and more destructive conflict. But another example would be, say, the visit of the Pope or the Dalai Lama. This could be an opportunity for peace building, for reaching out between religions in particular. But it could also be, depending on the context, something that sparks conflict. So in each of these elements, there are strong roles for religion. Religion or interreligious tensions can be a type of grievance upon which conflict is based. But how that manifests in conflict or not depends very much on how religious leaders mobilize people, either for conflict or against conflict. Religion, as I mentioned, also provides many of those resiliencies. So commonalities between religions and religious scriptures, for instance, about peace or about violence or about how one relates to enemies or neighbors. These can be drawn out from those religious texts in contrast to what other people are drawing out from religious texts to emphasize the peaceful aspects of religion, to emphasize their commonalities. And that also is a matter of leadership. So you can have either positive or negative leaders amongst religious leaders and institutions. And sometimes you can transform one from a destructive path to a more constructive path. And that's actually a large part of what that expeditionary diplomacy that I talked about is all about, is having people there who can actually build the relationships and the trust with religious actors on the ground at the subnational level to try to transform what they're doing into a more constructive direction. And then also the issue of timing, it comes up. So religious holidays can be either a time where conflict is more likely, or they can be a time to bring people together around some commonality, or to better understand the other side. So having talked a little bit about how that approach to conflict analysis informs our thinking about a particular context, let me talk a bit about some of our specific engagements. But before I do, let me just lay down a few dimensions that I see in our work. So there's a number of ways in which we, a number of types of religion and conflict situations that we encounter. So one dimension is inter-religious conflict between different religions, which we actually deal with fairly rarely. One example is in Burma, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. And if we go forward with operating in the West Bank, as I mentioned before, that'll be a more directly relevant to that type of conflict. But another type is intra-religious conflict. So conflict between different adherents of a particular religion, often between more extremist views of that religion and more moderate views. So one example of that we are dealing with is in Syria, where we're dealing with extremists within Islam and even within a particular sect of Islam, and trying to reduce their influence on what's going on. But another type of conflict, which may not so readily come to mind, is conflict between religion and the state. So in many of the places we've worked, there's a rather repressive state that is trying to repress and control religion. Or there could be a situation where religions are in rebellion against the state, or where religious control of the state is oppressive to other religions. And then there's the issue, which I'm sure you're familiar with, of religion being in conflict with other aspects of culture and modernity, or even conflict between different people over what is actually religious versus what is cultural. And this intersects a lot with issues of youth and with gender as societies evolve. And then there's finally the issue where we interact with it mostly. And this is simply religion and religious actors being important aspects of a conflict system. So the conflict isn't about religion per se, it's not between religions per se, and yet religion is there, and religious actors are there, and they're important players that we can work with to try to make this a more positive situation. And that is the mode in which we interact with it most often, because that touches on just about every conflict that we deal with. So let me run through some of our engagements and talk about each one. So first, some examples of the conflict between religion and the state. We did a conflict analysis in Uzbekistan. And this is a very oppressive, authoritarian state where they're very much concerned about the possibility of Islamic extremism being a threat to the state. And therefore, there's very strong control of religious institutions in Uzbekistan. There are the only kind of mosques that are allowed, for instance, are the official mosques, and the imams are actually more or less told what they're going to say. There are, in contrast, some unofficial mosques, but they are illegal, and they are oppressed, and people are thrown in jail for participating in these. Which created an issue for us trying to understand conflict in the society, because for us to, we could go and talk to the official imams, but that was unlikely to be a very accurate reflection of the society. But for us to go and talk to people involved in these unofficial mosques, meeting in people's homes, would be to endanger those people, would be to call attention to them. So that made it very methodologically difficult for us to do a conflict analysis in this kind of environment. But it also makes it difficult to partner with them in the longer run. And then another aspect of this is that in the state's zeal to round up and put in jail extremists, a lot of people who are simply highly religious get caught up in that sweep. And sometimes spend quite a bit of time in jail and are sometimes quite abused there. Another example is in Zimbabwe, where we also did a conflict analysis. We found that in trying to find independent actors to talk to, we were looking at religious leaders, but we found the bishops had been severely repressed by the Mugabe regime. And so to find really independent religious voices, we could only really find those down at the local level, not at the higher levels. Another kind of issue comes up with the state and religion, but it's more on our side, and that's the Establishment Clause, which I mentioned earlier. So here's an example of how that played out for us. In Bangladesh, we were supporting or overseeing an interagency program that was trying to prevent extremism in Bangladesh by trying to bring a stronger curriculum, a secular curriculum, into unregulated madrasas in Bangladesh. It was initially called the Madrasa Reform Project. And this wasn't to replace their religious instruction or tell them how to do that. It was simply to bring in a more diversified curriculum. So for one thing, that the people of these graduating from these unregulated madrasas would actually have a chance of getting into college. And one of the key things we were doing is bringing English language instruction into those madrasas, which connects them to all sorts of broader knowledge. But this got held up in legal wrangling. It had initially been approved by State Department lawyers, but it was an interagency project, and the USAID lawyers took a different view on whether this violated the Establishment Clause, because we were working with just one religion, even though this is a country where some 80% or more of the people are Islamic. So this got held up for a full year. And legal wrangling. Finally, it got renamed the Community Schools Project and was officially open to any sort of community school, not just the unregulated madrasas. Even though the program had nothing to do with religious content, it did not have a religious purpose. It was a counter-extremism purpose. But still, this held us up for quite some time in this particular case. So then, more broadly, I spoke about how we often deal with religious actors as partners in a conflict system, even though the conflict isn't about religion. So in Nigeria right now, we have a program in the Delta that is trying to use media to promote positive examples of citizens successfully getting government to respond to their needs and provide services by highlighting successful examples of this in the media, and then working to promote expansion of those efforts or copycat efforts in other areas and expand this mode of interaction with government, and as a counterpoint to the notion or the dominant narrative that violence pays, and that's the way to get things. So we have this Nigerian board of directors that are civic activists and business people and people in the creative industries who have volunteered to help guide this project going forward and to make it sustainable in the long run, and even to make it commercially viable so it's truly sustainable as we back out. And the chair of this board is a Catholic priest who's been very active in this, and he got us involved in coming to speak to the Niger Delta Catholic Bishops Association and get them much more involved in this project. And they're very excited about how they can contribute to this. So that's one example of how we've worked very closely with some religious leaders. Now, an interesting aspect of this is that it's proven a bit easier for us to work with the Catholic Church. And one reason for this is that some of the Protestant evangelical churches are a little bit more vitriolic in their talking about religious conflict, particularly what's going on in the north with Boko Haram. So they're a little bit harder for us to work with in this regard. And the Catholic Church is a bit broader and a bit more interested in this kind of work. And that's not true of all Protestants there, for sure. But that has come up as an issue, and has come up elsewhere, as I'll mention in a moment. Then another problem is that a lot of the religious leaders there also run for office. So they're mixed in with the political structure, and that makes it harder for us to work with them as civil society leaders. Another example is in South Sudan, which I mentioned earlier. We had many religious partners at the local level, largely with Christian churches. And an interesting thing, they were very much involved in helping us get peace messaging out, and which means trying to motivate citizens to take a peaceful, nonviolent approach to expressing grievances. there, where we had issues with religious leaders, it was more traditional religious leaders, like local witch doctors or shamans. And part of the potential reason for this is that they were more closely tied to traditional identities, where much of the conflict was between those identities, whereas the Christian churches were more likely to bridge those identities, more likely to have ties with both sides and also have an interest in promoting peace between those ties. So that was an interesting dynamic of the work there, and that's also something of a trend, is that religious institutions that are larger, that bridge the identities that are in conflict with each other, are in a better position to be peace builders. But that's not necessarily the case. So one example from my Northern Ireland research, which is interesting because what I mentioned before was an ecumenical effort, was a group within the Protestant side. It was called the Evangelical Contribution on Northern Ireland. It's now changed its name to Contemporary Christianity, and I forget exactly, it's CCCI now, but it was then called the Evangelical Contribution on Northern Ireland. What they did was they very publicly issued a letter that against what Reverend Ian Paisley, who was this chief firebrand behind the Protestant nationalist side, or unionist side, I should say. They challenged him in public based on the gospel and calling him back to what they said was the true meaning of the gospel, a peaceful understanding of the gospel. And this actually created credibility for them, this Protestant group, with the Catholic side, and put them in a position to start engaging in track 2 diplomacy between moderate Catholics and moderate Protestants. And ultimately, they were able to bring in the hardliners, including Ian Paisley, who they started out publicly opposing, and actually played a significant role in the efforts leading up to the Good Friday Accords in Northern Ireland. And that's an example of this sort of peaceful voice from within a particular community. So it's not necessarily a bridging group that you need to be involved in a positive way. So then in Kenya, in 2007, 2008, there had been horrible ethnic riots associated with the election. And some religious leaders had played an incendiary role then, and some religious leaders had played a protective peace-building role. So in the later election in 2013, we had an effort to try to prevent a resurgence or recurrence of that conflict in hotspots throughout the country. And part of what we did was we expanded existing early warning, early response networks to include religious leaders, as well as business leaders and others. And some of these religious leaders were very effective at getting the peace messaging out and also convening people and using their institutions and their status to promote peace. But here again, we also had a similar problem with some of the more extreme Protestant churches. And I think this is related to Protestant churches being more smaller. And so you have a lot of smaller congregations rather than necessarily one big church. And again, they can get tied up with a particular identity that's in conflict with another identity, and they're less bridging than a larger church is. And again, it wasn't all Protestant churches, but where we did have problems with them promoting violence, it tended to be the Protestant churches. Then in Honduras, we are working against the drug violence that's going on there. So this is a bit different. It's not an identity-based conflict. And yet, it is the murder capital of the world. It's a lot of people dying in Honduras. And so we're viewing it as a type of conflict. And here we're working very much with religious leaders, both Protestant and Catholic. And they are, amongst other things, very much involved in that peace messaging role from the pulpit throughout Honduras. And here, I think, the dynamic that I was talking about doesn't apply because it's not an identity-based conflict. So it doesn't matter as much how bridging the religious institution is, because association with a particular identity isn't particularly relevant to the type of violence that's going on. In Syria, I mentioned before, what we're trying to do is to strengthen the opposition through nonviolent assistance. So one aspect of that is to try to promote the ability of moderates to govern an area, and providing them training and equipment, secure communications gear. We're also trying to promote the free media in Syria, by providing them assistance and equipment. And in both these elements, it's promoting moderates versus extremists and increasing their ability to draw adherents away from the extremists, and to promote a narrative of inclusion, including across the sectarian divide, which threatens to deepen and worsen because of this conflict, which has something of a sectarian nature. Then in Burma, we were there anyway to try to deal with the larger peace process between ethnic minorities and the government. But a conflict erupted between one of those minorities and another minority. So the Rohingya minority, which happens to be Muslim in the Rakhine state, was being slaughtered by the ethnic group that lived there that was Buddhist, like the majority group there. And some extremist Buddhist monks were very much involved in promoting this violence and spreading it. So this was a conflict that was against a minority, which they saw as being foreigners, being from Bangladesh, even though they'd lived there quite a long time. But had the potential to expand into a much broader interreligious conflict between Buddhists and Muslims. And in fact, it started to do that. So non-Rohingya Muslims started being assaulted elsewhere in Burma. And so our approach to this was to try to find moderates on either side, both the local level and the national level, and involve them in dialogue on how to calm this situation down. But an interesting aspect of this was we didn't want to openly describe this as a religious conflict because of the potential for that to make that fait accompli, simply by talking about it in that way. So we were careful to try to talk about it as minority violence, even though we were conscious of the religious overtones of this and the potential for it to spread into a broader interreligious conflict. And finally, in Bangladesh, again, our current engagement there, we're trying to conduct a media campaign kind of thing, somewhat similar to what we're doing in Nigeria, but it's on the protection of minorities in general. And the idea here is because Bangladesh has a problem with rampant political violence every time there's an election between the two main parties, one of which leans towards Pakistan, one of which leans towards India. And one of those is associated with a political party that is kind of a fundamentalist Islamic party. So there are some religious aspects in that political violence between those who are more secular and those who are more religious. And then also, and this gets played out in the violence against minorities in Bangladesh, against Hindus, which is connected to that political tension between those who support Pakistan and those who support India. So we've consciously made our effort about protecting minorities as something that we see as a safe issue that all Bangladeshis, at least in words, ascribe to, is that we should protect minorities, that everyone should be welcome in Bangladesh. But we've consciously not made it about the religious aspect of that because that's too tied to that current political dynamic. And we feel like making it about, so if we made it about protecting Hindus, per se, that would probably make the whole thing less effective, including for Hindus, because it would make it look more like the United States is interfering in the politics of the country, and make it look more like it's benefiting one side of the political divide. So all the minorities, including the Hindus, are better served by us making it about minority protection in general. And then we're hoping that this can be a wedge issue the more we talk about nonviolence and anti-violence regarding minorities in general, that we can ultimately turn this into let's have a broader discussion about violence in general, including that political divide. I want to end with a few questions because I know you're hungry for research questions. And perhaps some occurred to you as I was talking. So one question is, what are the perceptions of the US government and our role in religion and conflict throughout the world? And I should say each of these questions would be profitably contextualized to particular places instead of simply trying to answer them in a general way, because I think context matters quite a bit. Then another question is, how does the US government best deal with differences in conceptions of the proper relationship between the state and religion? We have this strong notion of separation, but many societies do not. And as a related matter, the role of religion in the public sphere, we have a different notion of that than many other societies. And how does the US government best negotiate both of these things given our own legal restrictions on what we do through the Establishment Clause? Another is, I mentioned those resiliencies that religion provides. Particular teachings about peace, about your neighbor, particular holidays that may reach across religious divides, particular sects within religions that are more peace-oriented. There are a lot of ways, a lot of resources that religion can provide for peace building, but these are contextualized. A lot of times these are the product of interaction between religion and a particular culture, and are tied up in that culture. So while there's been a lot written about, the commonalities of religious scriptures about peace, that's in a very general way. What we could really use help on is within a particular culture, within a particular context, what are the resiliencies that are there that are part of that interaction of culture and religion in that particular place? I've mentioned several times the issue of what we could call bridging versus bonding religious institutions. So how the diversity within religious institution relates to the conflict in that society, and how can we best interact with single identity religious institutions versus internally diverse religious institutions. And then finally there's the issue of transforming bad actors to good actors. And how is this best done with religious institutions? How can we get them to look within that religion to find the resources or motivations that drive them towards being a more peaceful actor rather than a conflictual actor? So with that, I'll finish. And I'm not sure. Oh, I've taken up most of the time.
So thank you for getting us off to an excellent start. I want to, first of all, I want to thank you for hiring one of our alums, Jamie Kirsch, a couple of years ago. And I believe
she's great. She's in Nigeria right now.
Right. I heard you mentioning the project in the Delta, and I was thinking, Jamie's out there, so that's really wonderful. I'd also be remiss not to mention that your boss, John Kerry, holds an honorary degree from UMass Boston, as does Imam Shafa. So it's a wonderful set of connections. I want to just take the privilege to ask the first question, and then we'll have a few minutes for some others as well. And it connects the two of the research questions that you put to us at the end, in particular about the relationship between the U.S. government and religion, and the ways in which the government can work on those questions and what some of the challenges are. One of the things that you talked about in your remarks was the importance of leadership as part of conflict transformation. And you talked about work that focuses on drawing out peaceful messages in religious texts and encouraging that as an act of leadership in conflict transformation. And I'm curious whether you could talk about both how CSO goes about trying to develop that kind of leadership and what some of the particular challenges are to doing that, given the nature of some of the constraints in the Establishment Clause.
Okay. So I would say, the key role that we have there is to reach out for religious leaders who are oriented towards taking a positive role or can be convinced to take a more positive role, to connect them with others of a similar approach. And that connecting is an important part of it, because we need to be reaching out to not just one community, but across communities. And then also reaching out not just to the religious, but also to the non-religious. So that's part of the approach that we need to take. But the important aspect there is that we're not excluding religious actors because we're afraid to interact with religious actors. So that's very much the push of policy right now, is to engage, just to be aware of the restrictions of the Establishment Clause so that you can engage in a way that is legally compliant. And as far as getting them to draw out the peaceful aspects of religious texts, we cannot be telling religious leaders what to say. We're not Uzbekistan. But we can encourage them in a more general way to try to think for themselves about how they can draw upon their own resources to promote peace in their speaking and in their acting. And we can get them to talk to each other about this, and that's probably the best way for us to do it.
Thank you. Other questions? Please.
Can you say a few words about the relationship with the governments within which countries within which you're operating?
So I believe the question is about how we work with host governments in the countries that we're operating. Well, obviously, we can't operate there if they don't, for the most part, although in Syria it's a bit different because we're operating in the areas that the government doesn't control. But even there, we're not directly in Syria, we're operating from the border. But in other situations, yes, we do have to get the cooperation, the permission of the government, which we work through the embassy to do that. And there's the potential that may place some restrictions on where we can go and who we can talk to.
There's a microphone coming across. Hang on one second, David.
David Steele, Brandeis University. Basic question on, you focus a lot on finding commonalities. I think that's important. In my experience, I've been about 20 plus years in this field of religion and conflict and peace building. I find that very often, even if there's a lot of commonality, the few points of difference become absolutely essential to why conflict escalates and also what one might do. I wonder if you can comment on that. How do you go about dealing with that? You talked a little bit about interpretation, but even there you're looking for kind of positive, peaceful examples in the texts that, might exist in different traditions. How do you deal with the differences that do exist in a constructive way?
Okay, well, there's two ways of looking at the differences between religions. One is as a potential problem, right? This can be the basis of conflict between them. And for that, I think it's important to promote dialogue between them, right? So that they can find ways of accommodating those differences, and dialogue between them and the state to help create a human rights situation that's respectful of all of those differences. And there's other offices of the State Department, which I mentioned, that focus very much on that human rights aspect of working with religion in conflict. But the other way of looking at it is a positive, is that those differences are resiliencies that we can work with, and that the way in which one religion has a positive role in conflict might be different from the way this other religion can have a positive role in conflict. And each should draw on their own strengths, right? And they should be encouraged to do so, which I think can also be partly a function of dialogue between them, or coordinated through dialogue between them. So where one of them has a strength in a particular aspect of peace building, they may take the lead there, where another one may take the lead where they have a stronger strength.
Thank you. Mercedes?
Are there other similar bureaus in other governments around the world that you work with that are similar to the work you do? And also, have you done any work with the Vatican Secretary of State, since that's a worldwide organization with certainly an emphasis on peace?
Yeah.
Sure. The question was whether there are similar agencies in other governments that the CSO partners with, and the other part of the question was whether they worked specifically with the Vatican.
Yeah. Okay. So the answer to the first one is yes. So as an example, in Syria, right now, I'm working on a joint evaluation of one aspect of what we're doing in Syria with the British government's stabilization unit, and similar units also with the Canadians and the Danes, who are all helping to fund this particular joint program in Syria. So those are just some of the actors. The Australians have a similar unit, and several other countries do too. We actually have a forum of stabilization unit leaders. I forget exactly what it's called. It's fairly recently created to try to promote cooperation between these similar units across governments. As for the Vatican, I don't think we've done anything concretely with them yet, but I know that Jerry White has been in contact with them about what we're thinking about doing in the West Bank. And we would see a prominent role for them in that.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question over here. Wait, if you could just wait 1 second, there's a mic coming across.
I very much appreciate the contextualization that you're suggesting, but I would like to put you on the spot and ask you, what is the one most successful strategy of all of the ones you've identified that you've seen work?
Specifically with religion and conflict, I think.
Yeah, that's a good subject.
Well, I think it's to turn your question on the head. The most important way of being successful is to work what John Paul Lederach calls elicitively with the partners that you're working with. So to not come in with something you've designed in Washington, but to work cooperatively with them to help design, first to understand what the problem is and what the potential solutions are, and then design the intervention for that particular context. So I think that's the most important lesson about what works and what doesn't. That makes it more effective, more efficient, and more sustainable.
Very good. Bruce, thank you very much for kicking us off this morning. You're wonderful. A token of our appreciation. Thank you.